age of information, an age when we are being bombarded with ever-increasing quantities of information made more accessible by the developments in information technology. The information professionals therefore have a vital role to play in a world faced with information explosion. The important tasks before the information professionals therefore can be listed as: decide as to what information is needed, look for the information, select the appropriate response, retrieve the information, process the information, record the information, review the information, present the information, and evaluate the task. In short, the specialized skills of the information professionals are retrieving, evaluating, organizing, and communicating. How do we inculcate these skills in the information professionals? What should be the successful learning process? These are some of the issues that require a thorough understanding. Let us view a discussion and see what the experts have to say in this regard.
We have assembled today to discuss on an important aspect of professional learning, namely management of successful learning. I am sure you will agree with me that this particular area has drawn attention to in the professional learning processes today. On my right, we have Professor Rosemary Radden, who is presently the head of the Department of Library and Information Science at the University of North London. She has had a long experience of professional teaching as well as organizing and managing libraries of different kinds, and has also been involved in the process of learning that should be imparted to professionals in this library information field. We are very happy to have her with us this morning. On my left, we have Professor Srivastava, who is very well known in this country as the University Librarian of the Delhi University, having contributed a good deal of writing on the subject of the one that we are presently today discussing. And he has had a number of books written on the subject, and he is presently involved in the successful implementation of these by introducing a subject, the University Grants Commission's proposal for a new curriculum on library and information science. Now, Professor Srivastava, could you give us your experience as to what this kind of successful learning and how to manage it, and what is the experience that we have in India in this regard?
Professor Rajan, we have to see as to what had been the meaning and connotation of education and teaching so far in human history, and as to why a newer terminology has come which says replace teaching, replace the emphasis on teaching by placing emphasis on learning. It is very well said that if a teacher has taught and a student has not learned, then practically perhaps the teacher has never taught. So in modern times, the term learning has obtained importance so that a person could pick up the details of learning, could be able to learn and develop skills of learning, and learn throughout one's life to obtain knowledge. After all, we all say that knowledge is real power. Our educational systems, our libraries, and our librarians should be agile in this respect and see to it that learning skills are developed, people practice and do learning all their life. I think this is one of the major responsibilities that may have fallen on the profession of librarians, namely to develop learning skills and to promote learning by the citizens, by students at schools, students at colleges, public through public libraries, and therefore they should also be first themselves a good learner.
Very well, Professor Srivastava. Could you, Professor Madam Radin, relate to us the experiences that you have in England in this particular area of importance?
Yes, and I will with pleasure. And some of the things obviously will relate and grow from the points you've just raised. And I think obviously the crucial thing that's faced us in the last few years has been the rapid growth of change both in technology and in social changes, and then linking the two things, so the socio-economic changes have been very, very fast indeed. And then of course education has had a crucial role to play within this context of change. So education itself has had to change, and therefore the teaching and learning processes have had to change. And if we're saying information is the fourth right of citizenship, then we have to support that right as part of the teaching and learning process. And to try and help us do that, the major shift for us has been the establishment, I think, of a national curriculum right across the country, which is very much geared towards supporting these changes, supporting technological change, supporting attitude change, and supporting expectation change, if you like. And within our own field, there's been yet another change supporting this education change, because the education of information professionals, that too has changed rapidly. So we have a much more flexible education system. We expect that people who emerge from that system will become information managers, resource managers, and much more proactive people, much more concerned with the whole area of teaching and learning in the widest possible sense. So change there has been, and particularly in these areas.
Well, this has particular effect on the whole system of education that we need to have in this country, which particularly in the present context of changing context of information, it is extremely important for us to take this responsibility and develop the skills in the entire school curriculum, in the college curriculum, and later in the research aspects, and also in the continuous education pattern that we should develop in this country. And Professor Srivastava, what do you think that we have in this country so far as the general education is concerned?
Well, Professor Rajan, you have rightly said that we have to endeavor for a change in all areas. Our education, unfortunately, is very much dominated today by telling to the students in classrooms and their ability to reproduce them in examination halls, whereby they obtain a certificate or a degree, and that's perhaps from A to Z of teaching and learning going on. Really speaking, modern notion, meaning, definition is not just this. It is make a student to be a self-learner. Instead of leaving them in classroom as passive listeners to what a teacher is saying, let us allow students to participate in the process of learning by assigning them tasks, by having smaller groups, by making them to go and prepare and gather some data, whereby they will be required to go to a library, use certain books, prepare some material, present it in the company of some of their colleagues under the overall guidance of teacher. Through this method, learning techniques are developed. However, for developing learning techniques, the human race has endeavored during last 100 years very actively to develop details, how to learn, how to read, how to think, how to write. And in order to fill in this major gap, I have myself made a very humble effort on writing books like Educational Development of Your Child, a Guide. This book I intended largely for parents, and teachers are also parents, and they can see in this book how to motivate a child, how to make him read better, how to make him write better, how to make him think better. Then I also wrote another book, for example, Fundamentals of Child Engineering, wherein I took that a child could be educationally engineered the day the child is born. And therein the role of parents is equally important. Education and learning is now two-legged race. It's no more total dependence on the teacher one-legged race. Unless parents and people in a particular home participate actively in developing the child to grow in learning process, I'm afraid learning is not going to develop. Then at the college, for example, having about 2 decades of librarianship of the University of Delhi, I found there was no book that we could give to a student coming to college, how to acquire excellence at college. Then I attempted a book on this very title, Acquiring Excellence at College, a tutorial's handbook, wherein a student could know the basic details of how to think, how to write, what are the objectives of his being in a college, apart from various subjects that they learn, and how to think, how to organize one's program, and how to keep that learning continuous throughout life.
Excellent, Professor Srivastava. Now let's look at the situation obtaining in various other parts of the world, particularly in UK. What do you think is happening in your country as far as the professional learning, and particularly on self-learning and independent learning, and what we are talking today about management of successful learning? What do you think is happening in your country?
A lot is happening, but obviously not enough, because one can always hope for and expect more change and more development. But a lot has happened and a lot is happening. And I think it's fair to say that that change has actually been focused on, if you like, the learning resource centre concept in relation to schools, because the whole idea of learning resource centres has contributed to this process of change, to managing information, managing the curriculum, managing resources, and managing learning. So this has all been, if you like, focused within education on the resource centre movement. And that has meant that anybody involved in that, particularly in our profession, has had to have very much of an active role in being involved in these changes. He or she hasn't been able to be, if you like, withdrawn from these changes. They have to be part of these changes. So in turn, it's meant that the information professional has also had to change. He or she has had to change in relation to attitudes and in relation to skills, and of course in relation to basic education. So there has had to be a radical overhaul and reappraisal of what's been happening in the education of information professionals to contribute in a very real and a very positive way to these changes in teaching and learning, because we're looking at total support in a true way for the independent learner. As you just said, it's not a single-legged race, it's a two-legged race. There has to be support of a very real kind. So information professionals have been contributing to this, and therefore there have been changes in their education, and just as important, in their continuing education. One can no longer say, I finished a course, complete, because that independent learning process goes on forever, and therefore anybody contributing to it themselves has to also change all the time. It doesn't stop. So I think a lot has been done, but there is still more that we can do and more that we should do.
Thank you. Excellent. What is happening in England has been beautifully narrated by you. Well, we are examining this in the context of our own professional training and professional preparation. And therefore, we should look into the different skills that are required and incorporate them into the curriculum, professional curriculum, possibly. And what do you think should go into the curriculum, Professor Srivastava, in the context of the Indian situation?
Professor Rajan, before we come to the curriculum or what we perform, I think very briefly I could say that what concepts should be generated in the minds of the parents and teachers. The parents should visualize that they can help their children in picking up certain learning skills, certain writing skills, certain writing skills, reading skills, and skills for thinking. So also the teachers, and most important in my view, the purpose we are sitting here, what the librarians can do. Say a school librarian should be aware of a package to be delivered to students of various grades in the library, and also he may share it with the teacher concerned. Similarly, a librarian in a college or a university should share the kit with the teachers and students by prominently displaying them, and maybe if the need is by giving a brief introduction. And what I expect that a person who graduates and comes in life should ask a question to himself: how can I obtain better information concerning my field of work so that I can produce better, I can render better services to the organization or the country as a whole? And therefore he has to go and obtain relevant literature, and herein also the librarians are required to help him. The concept of learning from cradle to the grave is to be practically demonstrated in a modern society if that society is going to remain viable, effective in the whole world. And for this purpose, let me briefly say, there are numerous textbooks which will say how to improve reading habit. There are numerous general books which will say how to write better. There are numerous general books which will say how to think comprehensively and effectively in a better way. Such books should be, first of all, read by the librarians themselves. In fact, the librarians themselves should be very good learners. And then they should in turn try to see that their clientele also acquire these skills and develop them and practice them in their life. The research done by, say, for example, International Reading Association from the United States has worked out numerous books. What are the concepts which one needs to develop for understanding social science subjects? What are the notions that one needs to develop for understanding physical sciences, humanities? So reading, thinking, writing, all these things in these various sectors have been worked out by International Reading Association. Various national associations are working in it. In India also there are now some books available in these areas. I myself have written 4 books, and I have also tried to develop the concept in my latest book, Teaching and Learning in 21st Century, wherein I have differentiated between what has been happening so far and how it should happen in the future.
Thank you, Professor Srivastava, to draw our attention to what is happening in this country as well as outside. Well, in any case, what is being discussed at our present context is with reference to the professional training and the preparations that are required for the entrance and the subsequent degree courses that are being offered. I think having been so much involved in this business of successful learning, what has been the efforts made in England to inculcate this habit in the professional student who is doing the courses in library and information sciences, and with reference to the curriculum and the details of the curriculum that have been designed in your country. Could you throw some light on these aspects, Professor Rosemary Ratt?
And again, this will pick up on the things we've been saying already, so I don't want to repeat them. But obviously, in relation to the education of our information professionals, it's very important that as part of their curriculum, they themselves understand the teaching and learning process. Because if we're talking about producing a student who is able to be motivated, to be able to be independent, to be able to be self-managed, to be able to be competent himself, then as you say, the person who's doing the teaching also has to understand this process. And they also have to understand the way in which people actually learn, the various styles of learning, the way in which these styles change in relation to particular circumstances. So really, what we're saying, there are 2 things, I think, that are happening that's important. One is that the theory of teaching and learning and education in general is part of the curriculum. That's part of it, and the students themselves have to understand these processes. It's no longer something that's considered, if you like, a little bit on the fringe. It's part of the curriculum. And the second element is the way in which the curriculum itself is being changed in its structure, as well as its content, its structure. So it's also much more flexible, it's much more open to change, and it therefore can respond to change much more quickly. Because there's no point in having a curriculum that's set in concrete while all these changes are happening. So I would say that 2 things are happening that are most important. One is including these elements within the curriculum as formal subjects, and secondly, making sure that the curriculum itself is also changed in its structure so it too can respond to change, and making sure the whole thing just hangs together. It's very much a holistic process. We can no longer step aside and operate separately. It has to be a holistic process. And it's no good then picking up on the skills that are needed and identifying those skills if they're not part of the total process. We can identify them, we will identify them, but they must be seen within a whole. That's the most important thing.
Well, we have been concentrating our attention on some of the aspects of successful learning, wherein we are considering the importance of information in the changing context. The changes are multidimensional. Changes with reference to professional, picking up a number of professional capabilities, and then the changes in education, which includes both teaching and learning, and also management of information institutions as well as management of educational institutions, and finally the individual. The individual has got to change considerably in the context of the changing environment. So what do you think the particular responsibility of the individual with respect to the changes that we are envisaging in the years to come? Professor Raghu?
I think the individual has got to understand, if you like, the basic processes of this teaching and learning element. They have to understand what happens. We can identify those, we can pinpoint them. The skills of selecting, processing, presenting, and evaluating. That's part of it. But I think that's, if you like, a minor element. The most important thing for the information professional to take on board now is that he or she also has to contribute to and be part of change in relation to management, to human resource development, to teaching and learning, and to change itself. So the individual person can no longer leave an institution of higher education and say, I've put that behind me, that's the end of that. They themselves have got a duty to be, if you like, part of the management of change and part of the process of change. And therefore, the whole education element in their lives has to be constantly updated, constantly tested, constantly challenged, and constantly reassessed. No longer can they afford to sit back and say, that's it. Now, that's a pretty tall order. And I think even more important than anything else is that that information professional has to know himself or herself very well. They have to be able to analyze the need for change, and just as important, to actually carry out that change. So it's knowledge of self that I think is the way forward. Without that, all we're doing is putting icing on a cake. If the cake's not very good and the cake's going to crumble, the icing isn't going to last. We have to make sure we have our cake correctly done, and then the icing will stay there. So it's knowing yourself and being part of that process of change and managing that change that I think is the way forward.
Well, I think we have touched upon a number of aspects, although the time that we had at our disposal was not sufficient for us to go into the details of the entire concept of successful learning. Yet we have gone into the concept of successful learning. We have gone into what is happening in the present context of the changing conditions and environment insofar as professional training is concerned, both in India and the UK. And we have also gone into the educational patterns that are developing in both these countries, and what is important for us to pick up from these and incorporate them in our own curriculum, and then the professional preparations and the professional training, education, actual practice, and a number of other ways we can impart these kinds of instructions to the participants in an educational program. And finally, we examined all these things in the context of the changes in the professional preparation, changes in the education, both in terms of teaching and learning, and management of education institutions. And finally, we got on to the point of individual picking up the skills necessary and then incorporating them into the actual practice of learning. And then see that this is imparted from generation after generation, and that at different levels of operation, and at various contexts we can see that this comes into operation. Thank you very much, Professor Raghu and Professor Srivastava.
Thank you.
Well, what we infer from this discussion is that There should be a shift of emphasis from teaching to learning. The education process is to be adjusted to change in technology, expectations, attitudes, skills, and learning styles. That, in view of all these changes, the education for information professionals has to change with time. That the students are to become active learners. They should be self-assured, flexible, motivated, creative, responsive, and able to manage the learning experience. That the learning process is a continuous one, and therefore emphasis should be given to continuing education for the overall development of the information professional.